My name is Maggie Howell, and I am the Executive Director here at the Wolf Conservation Center. Before we get started, just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your control panel, and we'll provide time for a Q&A session at the end of Dr. Treves' talk. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available on the Wolf Conservation Center's website later this month, so we will let you know. All right, so let's get started. I'm really excited. Tonight we're joined by Dr. Adrian Treves, who has generously offered to discuss predator science and the law. Adrian earned his PhD at Harvard University in 1997 and is now professor of environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2007, Dr. Treves founded the Carnivore Coexistence Lab at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Adrian's research focuses on how to balance human needs with wildlife conservation. And he's authored more than 150 scientific papers on predator-prey ecology or conservation. Well, I'm really excited to get started. So I'm going to turn things over to Adrian now. So thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Maggie. And it's really a privilege to be here. I want to thank Maggie Howell and her team, especially the IT help, Mark, her team at the Wolf Conservation Center. Thanks so much for making time. I realize all of you are busy people, and making time to hear this webinar is a real privilege. Thank you so much, especially before the holidays. I wanted to activate my video, but I've lost my mouse, so I'm going to go straight into the presentation. Oh, there we go. I can say hi in person. Again, I want to welcome everybody to this webinar on Best Available Predator Science and the Law. I'm Adrian Treves, Professor of Environmental Studies in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I welcome all of you, whatever your walks of life are, to this webinar. Thanks for showing up. Let's see if I can advance the slide. Here we go. All right, as many of you are aware, values towards animals have been changing over time from a view of animals as objects for human use to more emphasis on the interests of animals, them having their own interests. All of these views are value judgments in one way or another. And we know that the debates about these changing values and the debates between people about different values play out in many different arenas. I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about how these value judgments play out in law or in the courts. And I'm going to talk a lot more about how they play out in science, in the scientific community. And that's because debates about value judgments over animals as objects for human use or values of animals as having their own interests, those value judgments and the debates that arise between proponents of the different value judgments often play out in the law or in courts, and often demand some sort of evidence or evaluation of evidence. And science is drawn in when that happens. And in the case of predator science, debates over values often play out over questions about killing predators, such as those you see here. Does killing predators protect domestic animals? Does it raise tolerance among the public? Does it reduce illegal killing? And I'm pointing you towards my website as an easy handle to send you to some evidence, but not because it's the only evidence. In fact, the point is that the answers to these questions don't hinge on value judgments or the identity of scientists or the value judgments of the scientists themselves, but hinge instead on questions of scientific integrity and standards of evidence. And that's where I want to focus my attention today, mainly. And I'm going to do that with a case study of wolves from Wisconsin that I think offers some valuable lessons to us all. I'm going to keep returning to the issue of value judgments to ask, how should science and the law handle these judgments? So to start with, let me define a few terms. What is the best available science or the best available evidence according to the law? I'm not a lawyer, but I've been reading up and listening and talking to lawyers, and in my opinion, my observations, it seems like courts examine evidence in one of three ways, or all three ways, the following three. They either defer to government agencies for expertise on evidence, or they look to scientific peer review. Sometimes they rely on judges' opinions. And depending on the court or the case, you might see all three of these come into play, or only a few of them to differing degrees. It's a little different for the scientific community when we ask what's the best available science. There's a well-established protocol for that that reflects scientific integrity. That is the ethics and the conduct of science, combined with the high standards of evidence. The highest standards of evidence, or what we call strong inference, are applied to answer what is the best available science. And finally, it takes lots of time and debate and discussion and data, which events in the real world often don't have the patience to wait for. But I want to give some more insight into how the scientific community looks at evidence, in hopes I can convince you to look at it in the same way, and maybe in hopes of garnering more patience for the scientific community to work out what is the best available evidence, especially for predator science. So to elaborate a little bit on scientific integrity, this comes from the National Academies of Science. There's four elements I think all scientists agree on. The first one's objectivity, where the judgments of scientists shouldn't be based on personal feelings or opinions, but on an impartial or detached weighing of evidence of the facts. Secondly, transparency is super important to scientific integrity, namely that all the methods, value judgments, assumptions, and analyses, but particularly the methods and the data, are clearly exposed to view. And to the view of whom? That's the third one. Independent peer review is super important. It's every step in the methods analysis and interpretation should be verified by experts who have no conflicts of interest and can confirm that the scientists producing those findings have done things as well as they could. And the fourth step is about reproducibility, that someone with your methods in hand should be able to replicate your findings. So I'm going to track these four principles of scientific integrity through our case study of wolves in Wisconsin. And I'm going to start with a little history here, that Wisconsin wolf policy in 1999 made a very clear value judgment that wolves would be hunted. And whatever you think about that, I want to convince you that we expect governments to make value judgments. That's part of their job. That's part of what we've elected them for and what our elected officials appoint government officials to do. So it's not necessarily bad, good or bad. Even if you disagree, that's part of democracy. Sometimes we don't get our way. We want government to make value judgments so we can act in accordance with the law and that the law makes sense to us. However, it's not so clear, not necessarily the case, that we want scientists to use their value judgments in their science. And I'm going to illustrate this with, as I said, Wisconsin wolf science in three parts starting in 1999, or actually a little bit before that, and ending today. I'm going to dive deep into this Wisconsin wolf case study, but I believe a lot of the elements are common, whether you're dealing with cougars, grizzlies, coyotes, what have you, any kind of predator anywhere in the country. I think you'll find it resonates. Some of the same principles apply. So I hope the case study is an example and illuminating in that way. Also, I'm going to really science the heck out of this, and I hope you'll bear with me. It's worth a bit of science to understand how the value judgments play out within the scientific community and how the evidence that comes out can be affected by those value judgments. And to do that, you'll have to understand the science. So forgive me, I'll try to explain it. it's worth the effort. So let's start with some of the data on the wolf population from Wisconsin from 1980 to the graph here in 2012. Those are the years arrayed along the horizontal axis at the bottom. The vertical axis on the left, or the y-axis, shows the count of two things. In the black numbers with a solid line, more or less solid line, is the number of wolves in late winter every year counted by census. And the dotted line without numbers is the number of wolf packs. And the source for my data, and throughout this presentation, my sources are indicated with the superscripted numbers. So I'm very grateful for this data. These data collected by Wisconsin Department of Natural Resource, or WDNR, biologists and staff, but also civilian volunteers, hundreds of them over the years. A very important source of these data. You'll see this graph again and again. I'm going to drill down into it to understand it better. In 1999, the WDNR released its state wolf management plan, and it has the same horizontal axis with years and the similar vertical y-axis with numbers, in this case numbers of wolves in late winter, and those numbers are shown with the white squares in the lower left half of the graph up until 1999 when the plan was released. And I'm going to try to answer a couple questions about this graph, like what is that heavy dark line, the curvy one that the arrow is pointing at? Why was that superimposed over the wolf population estimates? Well, listen, plans need to plan for the future. They need to make predictions or forecasts. And to make forecasts scientifically, plans need theory and a model. And there was a theory called density dependence applied to this population to build the model. So what is density dependence? It's a theory that as populations use up their resources in the area they occupy, the scarcity of resources is going to slow down reproduction or lead to lower survival, higher mortality rates. And populations that typically follow density-dependent population dynamics show the growth curve that the arrow is pointing at. Recent reviews of evidence suggest about 70% of animal populations show this kind of growth, this density-dependent growth in their populations. So it seemed like a reasonable starting point. They certainly had alternatives, though. There were other models they could have used. There's another aspect to this graph I should explain. It's in the figure caption. This model assumes a carrying capacity of 500 wolves. And carrying capacity refers to how many wolves could the state have held once they filled out all the available space, right? Because as resources become more scarce, the wolf population would stop growing. There were two estimates of carrying capacity, which is also called capital K. There were two estimates of carrying capacity in 1999. K could be somewhere between 500 to 662 wolves. Okay. So the plan made a prediction. It had a forecast for the future based on theory and a model with carrying capacity as part of the model, and the theory was density dependence. The first value judgment that was made, as I said, was by the government that wolf hunting would be part of management of wolves at some point in the future. And it was integrated into the 1999 State Wolf Management Plan as Appendix J of that plan. That was actually removed before publication because of a public outcry against it. However, the model and the theory remained in place. And the architects of this model chose two numbers. So they made another value judgment. Value judgment number 2 here. They chose two numbers. The first was for the delisting level of 250 wolves. That would be the state delisting level when wolves in Wisconsin were no longer considered by the state to be threatened or endangered. That would happen at 250. And you'll notice that's 50% of the lower estimate of K. The second number was 350, the management goal, which was 53% of the higher estimate of K, so very close to half of K again. And the management goal was the goal that the architects of this model believed the state should manage the wolf population towards 350 wolves in late winter. So two value judgments were made. The reason I call the text in red a value judgment is they could have picked a number anywhere on that curvy line of density-dependent population growth. Any value could have been chosen. They made a judgment to choose two numbers, both of which were half or around close to half of the current estimates of carrying capacity, or K. Let's go on and see what happened next. Well, the same graph, again, of wolf population growth shows the years after 1999. And a couple things happened. The population passed the first estimate of 500 and came close to passing the second estimate of 662 by 2009. And yet, the population target stayed at 350. And even after the population of wolves grew past a K of 880, the management target of 350 wolves remained in place. Also, the architects of the state model between 2007 to 2009 began talking about their model and writing about it, and they identified only one scenario for their value judgment number 2. They talked about maximum sustained yield. So what is MSY? In theory, the point of maximum sustainable yield, or MSY, is half of K. And it's the point at which growth is fastest and the more of the young of any population are produced and can be harvested at the highest rate without impairing that population's later growth. So MSY, or maximum sustainable yield, is this theoretical point at half of K, 50% of K, where one can harvest the maximum amount sustainably. So the architects of the state model for wolf populations had made a value judgment, not just about the management target for wolves, but that they would be harvested at the maximum sustainable level. None of this was made obvious to the public. In fact, this webinar today, with me explaining it to you, is the first time, to my knowledge, that it's ever been made public to explain the decisions from 1999 to 2009 about the wolf population target, or the state model that was being used to make forecasts about the wolf model. Now, as I said, the population exceeded these targets. And as late as 2013 and even beyond, the state management goal of 350 hasn't changed. So if you take half of 880, MSY, or the point of maximum sustainable yield, if it's correct, would be around 440. So the state management goal of 350 is far below 440. And as the architects of the state model themselves explained, having a population target far below half of K is risky for the population that you're hoping to harvest. Furthermore, we have another problem, that many of the assumptions of the theory of density dependence had not been tested then. The assumptions hadn't been tested to see if they were true, and many still remain untested today. So what I'm going to do is sort of keep a tally over these 3 periods and the 3 parts of my story. I'm going to keep a tally about what scientific integrity looked like at this point. And I'm giving you a sneak preview. I think it was already off to a shaky start because the objectivity was not there. The state architects had modeled for wolf hunting only with one scenario and focused on one maximum sustainable yield scenario without testing any of their assumptions. So that's a ding against objectivity, because scientists should evaluate multiple alternatives even-handedly. And the transparency was very poor. As I said, these models and theoretical assumptions had not been explained until 2009, and even then, not fully transparently. No independent peer review had yet happened, because these had been published either in government reports or in a book that was edited by the authors of by the architects of the state model. And so far, there had been no effort to reproduce the findings of the model. But listen, this was early days, and one could argue that the architects of the state model were doing the best they could in a fairly short order, a short amount of time. So when we look at the question of the best available science back then, we only had one model out there until 2000, from 99 to 2009. There was only one kind of available science. The courts started addressing evidence in a series of court cases involving wolves under the Endangered Species Act, and the courts tended to block delisting of wolves, or block efforts to liberalize wolf killing at that point. So let's look at the next phase in the history of wolf policy after 2009. Well, now I need to bring you back to that wolf population, but I'm going to talk about methods for how wolves are counted, or census methods. Those methods changed twice in important ways, shown by the asterisks on the graph here. In the winter of 94-95, the state brought on a much larger number of civilians to help track wolves in the snow. It rose from 12 the previous year to 40 in the winter of 94-95, and remained high or even increased in the years that followed. And sometime between 2001 and 2004, another change in methods was implemented by the state, where these citizens, these volunteer trackers, were required to take training, and more quality control was exerted over their data. Now, this had a pretty important, apparently was associated with a pretty important change in population growth estimates of those Wisconsin wolves, shown for the 3 periods in the previous graph. So before volunteers were brought on, average population growth was 8% and highly variable, with the plus or minus 23%. In the middle period, before the quality control and the training was required, average annual population growth was 22%, with less variability, about 15%. After the quality control changes were made, population growth dropped to 10%, with plus or minus 8%. Now, this is not necessarily that the wolf population growth slowed or accelerated, but could have to do with the methods or the census, this extra effort put in by the volunteers. These are very significant changes in population growth rates in the 3 periods. And I want to quote one of the architects of the state model directly, who pointed out that in the winter of 94-95, there was an apparent spike in the wolf population between 46 to 66% in 1 year. That is an unheard of growth rate in a single year by even a medium-sized population. And the architect of the state model in this case indicated that it almost certainly had to do with having missed wolves in the previous years. However, in 2014, the architects of the state model claimed there were 3 policy periods. I'm using their wording here. That those 3 periods in which the methods changed, as I showed you, were actually 3 different policy periods. When you drill down and look at state or federal policy, nothing really changed in 1994 to 95. I mean, nothing changed in policy, just the census methods changed. Between 2001 to 2002, when they first detected the need for quality control and training their trackers, again, no change in state or federal policy at that time. The first change in federal policy occurred in 2003, and then it changed 6 more times until 2012, and even beyond, when state and federal policy began changing. So I would argue that it was misleading to claim 3 policy periods and not be transparent about the change in census methods that were associated with such significant changes in the apparent population growth of the Wisconsin wolf population. So again, my simple tally of scientific integrity starts to look a little worse from 2010 to 2015. In terms of objectivity, there's no change, or it's getting a little worse with not fairly evaluating evidence. With transparency really getting worse. Methods of data were incomplete or misleading. And reproducibility, well, that comes next, but attempts by independent researchers to reproduce some of these results were attacked or ignored. And then finally, was peer review independent? Well, we start to see independent peer review, maybe. Not clear how independent it was until a little bit later. So the conclusion that came out of some of the independent research, or our conclusion about the independent research coming out, is that killing predators does not do what the government expected. And my photo of a cougar here is to remind us that I'm going to step out of the wolf case to some extent, and some of these results apply to other predators and other predator science. So what do I mean? That killing predators does not do what the government expected. At least that's what I would conclude. Well, from 95 to 2012, independent modelers could not reproduce density dependence or the effects of wolf killing on illegal take. Between 1980 and 2012, independent modelers could not reproduce estimates of wolf mortality or the effects of policy changes on poaching. And between 2001 and to 2013, independent researchers could not find any support for the idea that tolerance for wolves or inclination to poach wolves would diminish when wolf killing was liberalized. All right, so what do we have here? We have 2 contrasting scientific evaluations of wolf population models and policy. Since 2013, those 2 models have been available. Well, I'm now going to talk about how the scientific community reacts to this kind of a debate within the science, and then turn to the courts and the public, how they respond or how they might respond to contrasting scientific evaluations like those I've just described for Wisconsin's wolves. So the scientific community has fairly well-established means for addressing scientific controversies, and it goes right back to the principles of scientific integrity, namely objectivity, right? Scientists evaluate alternatives fairly. They look at all the evidence, both sets of models, and even if their personal preferences conflict, they don't choose their personal opinions over the evidence. The scientific community looks for transparency. Have the assumptions been exposed? Have value judgments been made explicit? Have each of the sides, if you will, shared all methods and data? And here's another note about value judgments. Scientists are pretty aware that everybody makes value judgments. Everybody has opinions. There's no such thing as the utterly objective scientist. And so the best thing to do is to just make one's value judgments and opinions clear, make them transparent, expose them to the light of the sun, and then proceed with the business of objectively evaluating evidence. And finally, independent peer review and reproducibility are major tools for the scientific community, and we should welcome these. And that includes collaboration with teams that disagree with each other. These are well-known tools for how the scientific community resolves differences between differing views of the same phenomena. There are also tools for fixing errors once they're made. These are also pretty well understood. We can fix errors. Authors can fix their own errors, correct them in the peer-reviewed literature, or retract a paper if correction's not enough. Or there's a new project called the Loss of Confidence Project. And scientists can publish a note that they may have lost confidence about their own work, even if no errors were made. And then scientists, of course, can debate each other in journals. So, taking a look at my tally for scientific integrity between 2016 to the present, when several new teams of scientists began looking at the same data, well, objectivity, maybe, I don't know if it improved because the scientific community became polarized, but at least more sides of the issue were being examined. Transparency was improving as some of these methods were being revealed. Reproducibility was improving simply because other independent scientists had tried to reproduce results. And yes, we had peer review, though there may be questions about the independence of the peer reviewers that are selected by journals and excluded by authors who might wish to avoid certain opinions. Okay, but what does the rest of our community do, like courts and the public, when there's disagreements between scientists? Well, here's where I switch to encouraging, because I'm a scientist, I can only speak for the scientific community here. I would encourage the public and the courts not to pick sides based on who you like or the results you like. Consider instead the scientific integrity and the standards of evidence that are displayed transparently in scientific work. This is hugely important because when science is based on personality or authority, it's not as strong science. The scientific community has known this for centuries, certainly for decades. And so we need to step away from the personalities around scientific findings and look transparently at the evidence. We have to step, just the way the scientists step away from their own opinions to produce good evidence, those consuming the product of science probably need to step away from whether they like or dislike it and instead look at it objectively if that's possible. Finally, I would encourage the public to demand independent peer review of scientists and of agencies. A great deal of predator science is published in agency documents that are not independently peer reviewed, and the quality of that peer review is super important. Independence is not just a word to throw around. It means disclosing conflicts of interest, disclosing where the money is coming, disclosing career advancement and the influence of interest groups on scientists. We all feel it. We just need to disclose it transparently. And that comes through independent peer review. Also, the public can demand scientific integrity, objectivity, transparency, independent peer review, and reproducibility are what guarantees high standards of evidence. And then finally, demand that those standards of evidence be followed and explained clearly to the public. There's more the public can do. I want to emphasize transparency here. So we talk a lot about predators and we talk about predator science, and we can do that with fewer euphemisms, more transparently. I'll just give two examples that I want to emphasize here. I want to emphasize stakeholders because that terminology is, it hides value judgments. Stakeholders conveys property or economic interests, and that's almost always going to exclude future generations of all life, even current youth, current non-humans. So the term stakeholder could be retired from many, many contexts in predator science, I believe. And when we talk about ignoring or underrepresenting future generations, let's also address I think a misconception that lawsuits and courts are somehow anti-democratic. The framers of the US Constitution understood this well, and we shouldn't forget it. The courts are the third branch of our democratic government. They are fully democratic by protecting the minorities against tyranny of the majority. So courts, if they overturn the majority's opinions, it's because they're violating the rights and the protections of the minority. So I think rhetoric that somehow treats courts, judges, or lawsuits as anti-democratic is very damaging to our democracy. And with that, I also want to emphasize the role of the US Constitution and the hierarchy of our laws. We talk a lot about the Endangered Species Act as a federal statute. That's important, that's powerful in our system of government. But the body of law that has been developed by courts, such as the US Supreme Court, that common law or case law, which includes the public trust doctrine, is also very powerful. Both, well, the US Constitution is supreme to both. So we should consider case law and common law side by side with statutes like the Endangered Species Act when we're evaluating the value judgments made by government or by scientists or by interest groups or by the broad public. And one value judgment in particular that derives from US Supreme Court decisions on the public trust doctrine is that the obligations of the state to preserve nature as a trust asset unimpaired for future generations is paramount. It can't be abdicated. And that responsibility might be a fiduciary one, where a fiduciary responsibility involves the most careful and sophisticated accounting for assets, using the best available science to account to the public for preserving that trust and regulating its use by current generations. So I want to end with a question. Partisan politics seems to have infiltrated or infected everyday life. Are we happy about that? In a democracy like ours, according to our Constitution, we have sovereign power. We decide how much power the government has. So I ask you, are we happy with the current state of affairs? Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Adrian. So we'll go ahead and take some questions now, but for those of you who joined after the introduction, we're here with Dr. Adrian Treves, and he just finished his talk on predator and the law. And so let me see, we have lots of questions here. Let's start with, what other models are used to determine wolf management goals or determining wolf populations?
Okay, that's a terrific question. So when a scientist needs to make a prediction about a population's growth into the future, there are at least 3 models they can consider. They can consider a density-independent model of population growth, or one that just involves exponential growth. Let me talk about the density-independent one for the moment. It's not ridiculous to consider that wolf populations, through a great period, a long stretch of time, wolf populations may grow in a density-independent way because they're so fiercely territorial that they're defending this territory with all of its resources from their neighbors. And so we might not expect that as the population size grows, that wolf packs are slowing down their reproduction or suffering lower survival. Likewise, if a wolf population has the ability to, or any predator population has the ability to spread geographically over vast distances, we might see exponential growth for a long period of time. And I actually believe that is what we saw in the Wisconsin wolf population until 2012. Simple expansion and exponential growth. The small changes that we saw in the growth over those periods were due to census methods, and then a federal policy starting in 2003 of lethal control of wolves, in my opinion.
Okay, what term do you suggest we might be able to use to replace the term stakeholders?
Well, let's be really transparent that many of these stakeholder processes involve interest groups and the government. And so if we want something that's truly participatory and fair to future generations, we're going to have to overhaul that model anyway. In collaboration with Francisco Santiago Avila and William Lynn and myself, we've just published a paper called Just Preservation. It's free, open access in the journal Biological Conservation. And our article, Just Preservation, lays out a framework for a more just and equitable way of deciding about the allocation of assets. Now, I'm not saying that all stakeholder processes become driven by interest groups, but those in which a decision to allocate assets from nature that belong to the broadest public, such as setting a harvest quota or setting population targets, those sorts of decisions are about allocating assets to one interest group or another, or capping a population. And those decisions need to consider future generations, today's youth, and possibly the futurity of all life to be fair, equitable, and just. Thanks for that great question.
All right. Here's one. I'm going to shorten it a little bit, but basically, is there a way to introduce the public trust doctrine into Canadian policy? Is there a way to begin the process through advocacy?
Okay, great question. I'm not an expert on Canadian law, certainly. There are a couple of cases, including the highest court in Canada, which allude to public trust duties. So it's not starting from scratch. It's not an entirely clean slate. But both Canada and the US do face a significant obstacle in implementing the public trust doctrine because it's not enshrined or codified in our constitutions for either country. So there is going to be a push, and there's going to be the need to push hard with the public, with politicians, with your government, using all the peaceful tools of a democracy. So good luck with that. Please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to know more.
Okay, this is in reference to one of your slides. Is the initial state of growth of the growth curve shown to us in the presentation a byproduct of poor methods of measuring the population? And in the case it is there a way to measure a fairly accurate error value?
Okay, it's a good question, and it's a technical question. I could, if whoever asked the question would like to contact me, I can put them in touch with Dick Thiel, who was the wolf population biologist. Sorry, I don't remember his specific title, but he was the biologist for the Wisconsin DNR for the wolf population in the early years. And as far as I know, is an expert wolf tracker. So there may have been a period in which certain wolf packs were missed, especially as the population grew larger, which I think justifies the decision to bring in civilian volunteer trackers to reduce the variability of the count from year to year. That was a good decision back in 94, 95, I would say. And to this day, the use of well-trained civilian volunteer trackers is a good idea if their data are verified and checked. So that's only half an answer to your question. I realize that, but I can't speculate about the quality of data in the early 90s.
Here's another question. Hunting as a value is hardwired into management. How can non-consumptive uses, such as viewing, be included as a use to be accounted for in deciding how many wolves to harvest? Yeah,
okay, so there is a tradition, a long-standing tradition of wildlife management agencies in North America affiliating more closely to extractive interests, hunting, trapping, hounding, fishing, etc., than to non-extractive uses. That's correct. That doesn't mean that's a permanent state of affairs, and it doesn't mean that that agency scientists and managers would not be willing to change. I believe there are people of goodwill out there who are doing their best, but are caught in a power structure where their career or their salary, their advancement, depends on towing a certain political line. Okay, so now we're in the realm of politics, and you know as well as I do all the tools of democratic change of policies, but I should also point out that there may be US constitutional or Canadian constitutional provisions that protect the broader public from an unfair takeover by a narrow minority. And those, you know, fighting that kind of a minority takeover of our instruments of government and of our public assets, there's a long history of how one combats that peacefully. So I would encourage folks to look at a number of mechanisms. I'm going to tell you my opinion now too. I don't believe that campaigns to make non-extractive users pay their fair share is quite appropriate, simply because non-extractive users are already paying through their tax revenues and through fees for parks and wildlife viewing and state parks and so forth. It's the extractive users who are obliged to pay to take wildlife assets for their private use, such as consumption or trophies. So I'm personally not a fan of making the non-extractive users pay. I'm a fan of using public trust doctrine to persuade and sometimes compel agencies to pay more attention to the non-extractive users. Thanks for that question.
How can the public support independent science?
Okay, this is huge. So I alluded to how the public and courts shouldn't be cherry-picking science based on their own personal preferences. This is extremely difficult to do. We bring our biases, our preferences, our opinions to the table when we start discussing these issues. But value judgments really need to be debated on ethical grounds as well as evidence grounds. If we could leave the scientific community to debate what is the best evidence, it's going to happen in a lot more quickly and a lot more cleanly and satisfying for the rest of the community out there if they're given consensus from the scientific community about what's the best evidence, and then they can argue about the ethics. So if one can, to a certain extent, leave the scientists to be independent, to debate evidence as they would, that will advance policy, I think, towards a stronger evidence base. Now, how do you do that? One way to do that is to get some of the money out of the science. That's going to require very transparent disclosures of financial conflicts of interest, including career advancement, promotions, things that people can get for presenting science that's favorable to powerful interest groups or to the government, which controls the purse strings. So I won't go further into my pie in the sky vision for independent science, other than to say, support your public universities because they have an eye on the ball for academic freedom and independent science to a greater degree than our government agencies do currently. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple of more. There's a lot of them. When you speak of harvesting at a sustainable rate, how does this affect the gene pool of the population? I'm thinking on the possibility of the population having started in a bottleneck-like situation. In such a case, would half of K really be as ideal a point of harvesting as it sounds like?
Okay, so I'm going to unpack that a little bit and try not to use euphemisms. I used harvest once, I think, in this webinar, and I'm not going to use it again because it's a euphemism for killing. And then I'm going to also correct the word ideal. There's no ideal unless you're saying that your ideal, your goal is maximum sustainable killing. That's just a value judgment based on a theoretical point, but any point along that curve of density-dependent population growth could be sustainable if the assumptions are met. So, back to your question, if predator managers decided to allow the killing of predators by the public for whatever purpose, then they should be required first to test the assumptions of their model of the population growth. As I said, I don't think the Wisconsin wolf population grew in a density-dependent fashion. And anyway, the assumptions of that theory were not well tested. And then finally, the wolf hunt that occurred in Wisconsin between 2012 to 2014 did not match the assumptions of such a model. For instance, breeding females and breeding males were not distinguished from other members of the population. So hunters and hounders and trappers could kill them without even recording it necessarily that they had killed such an animal. That's not part of the assumption of the harvest models, so-called harvest models used by the architects of the state model. So I'm calling for a great deal more caution by those predator managers that are required to or decide to implement predator killing for the public. Much more caution about their assumptions and therefore the quotas they set to avoid the risky situation that Wisconsin fell into. I hope that answers your question. I don't have much to say about genetic bottlenecks. It's not my area of expertise, but thanks for the question.
Okay, so here's the last question. Based on your research in Wisconsin, what are your thoughts on Washington State's policy development with wolves and the science in its studies versus science used in policy making?
Okay, thank you for that question, and hello to the Washington folks. Whether they're agency or NGO, reach out to independent scientists for collaboration. I've been reaching out to them since, I think it's 2014, if I remember correctly, and have had trouble having a dialogue, even a conversation with agency scientists for whom I have respect. And I think I've approached them respectfully. So collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. I think the situation we're in now is where agency scientists and some scientists closely affiliated to agencies are actually afraid to reach out to independent scientists for fear that their cherished opinions might not live up to the evidence. That's a situation we have to fix. So let's work together, I would say. And as for the policy process historically, well, tomorrow's a new day. I think there have been cases in which value judgments have not been transparent to the public, and the science backing them up has not looked at all the options objectively.
Well, Adrian, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to cover before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank people for making time during a very busy time of the year. And again, Maggie, thank you for the resources of the Wolf Conservation Center and for your own help. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thanks. And thanks to everyone who joined. We really appreciate you being here. If any of you would like to learn more about the Wolf Conservation Center or our scientific webinar series, or the 48 wolves who call the center home, please visit our website at www.nywolf.org. Adrian, thanks again for offering your time to discuss this interesting topic, and we hope to see you all again. Thank you.